Good evening and welcome to Peoria Riverfront Museum's virtual museum. You are viewing room, and we are live tonight, and we have an amazing topic with some amazing people. This is our trifecta uh, appearance as a great trio, in my opinion. With me tonight, I have a neurologist from OSF Healthcare System in Peoria, Illinois, Dr. Sarah Zallek. How are you tonight? And also
I'm
board member of the Peoria Riverfront Museum, I cannot forget. How are you tonight, Sarah?
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you for having me again as
You
the
bet. Pleasure seeing
regular
you.
guy in the group.
And our guest curator with Peoria Riverfront Museum, Mr. William Heidrich. Bill, how are you tonight?
I'm great and happy to be here with you all and technically connected.
He is technically, we had a little scare, but we are in the game. And if Bill's not with me, I'm a little nervous. So I'm glad we're I'm glad we're hooked
Well,
up.
glad you're relaxed.
That's right.
I think by the time we get through with this pandemic business, we're going to be really good at teleconferencing art conversations.
I think the bar is pretty high, Sarah. First, I want to make sure and thank all of our Visionary Society members and all of our members of our museum who are really helping to make this programming happen, to make it happen as frequently as we've been able to, and we appreciate you so much. So I hope you enjoyed tonight's topic, which is actually a continuation of the first two viewing rooms that we have done together as a group. And we've been exploring some concepts about spirituality and art, mainly from the Renaissance, but we are moving ahead a little bit in history and moving into the 20th century, and we're going to talk about Mark Rothko. And our topic tonight is tentatively titled, unless at the end of this we decide it should be something else, The Sacred and Sublime. And Mark Rothko, probably one of the most loved abstract expressionist painters, so-called, in America. Abstract expressionism is an American art form emanating from around the late 1940s into the 50s. And generally speaking about abstract expressionism, one would say large scale, total abstraction, very little, if any, representational imagery, if any at all. And out of these kind of precepts come various different directions. And Mark Rothko, one of the most intriguing and most original directions in the world of abstract expressionism. I'll just say a little bit. This isn't going to be about his entire life. We do not have that much time. But I want to just kind of give you a little background. Marcus Rothkowitz has essentially immigrated to America as a young Russian Jew, and he's essentially born in what at the time was Russia, in an area called Zvinsk, and now known as Latvia. And he's born in 1903, and by the early 20th century, he is in Portland, Oregon. So about as far over on the coast as you can go, making a beeline. And by way of Ellis Island, his family finds themselves in a very fascinating location, and clearly a different location than what the location that they left. He's educated at Yale at a time in his life that, of course, brings forth much of this. I think what we're going to find is really a closet philosopher in Mark Rothko. It stimulates a lot of thought. However, his recollection of his time at Yale was not great. He considered them elitist and actually racist, and did not have a wonderful experience there. As he moves along, however,
He left Yale. Actually, I'm going to interrupt because my job is to barge in, I think.
Please do.
But
as you do, Sarah, I will share my screen.
Yeah, I read that he left Yale because he hated it so much. But he didn't. He grew up not wealthy, and he didn't like the atmosphere at Yale and left before he finished his degree.
Yeah, he was extremely bright and clearly could have, and probably was a standout, I would imagine. But you know, these were intense times in America. I don't know that they're too much less intense today.
But you know,
Yeah.
actually, Bill, Sarah has interrupted you in this regard, but
Yeah.
it's important for us to remember with the social upheavals we are experiencing now that as much as we love this country, we've experienced social upheavals before, and it hasn't been restricted to one particular group. And at that time in the 20s, anti-Semitism was rife.
Wow.
And he was Jewish. I'm sure with an intellectually precocious, curious mind, being Jewish at a place like Yale, which was absolutely wide establishment,
Sure.
would have been difficult, hard to fit in, hard to assimilate. And that's what would have been required.
And we have to remember, this isn't rocket science, but changing his name from Rothkowitz to Rothko was obviously a common thing that happened with Jewish immigrants to try to curb as much of that anti-Semitism that could be curbed.
To assimilate.
Exactly.
Yeah, to assimilate.
And there were so many Roths, and he considered that and actually made the decision to include the KO as a way to kind of distinguish himself from the masses, yet as Bill says, assimilate. That is a fact. Rothko's earliest influences are, well, they begin to take shape through the surrealists, and which are really that movement, preeminently a European-born movement that is really informing American art like a tidal wave. So he is not unlike many other painters, and I'm going to advance my slide here and show you a couple of works, and one is much earlier than the other. And of course, the one on the left I'll point to here, heavily influenced by surrealism. And I'm not going to show a ton of these, but mainly to kind of give you an idea of where he is emotionally and where he is intellectually as he's thinking about how to advance American art. Do you have any thoughts on just generally how much surrealism was influencing American art, Bill?
As you think about that, but before you talk about your learned thoughts about that, I did read that, and most of us who are not art experts but are art enthusiasts know that Salvador Dali is the probably the best known surrealist. They were born in the same year. They were both born in 1903, which I learned. Yeah.
Ironic. I did not know that.
Yeah, so they were truly contemporaries. Okay, Bill Heidrich, now for some actual expertise.
I find the influence of surrealism a good bit less formal, rather more the spirit. I think it helps us understand the path he takes to the religious and art, to the religious and the sublime. I mean, the formal aspects he abandons fairly quickly. And once you introduce or bring in the Milton Avery influence, it's curious to me, I see lots of formal relationships between Avery and Rothko, more so than, say, with the surrealists. But it appears to be a convenient path for us to understand the development of his art. And there's always the danger of constructing something that in hindsight is easy to see, which may or may not have been the case. But it appears so here, but I wouldn't put too much emphasis on it.
Yeah.
The formal things are what really interest him and take him to the much deeper, more profound Rothko that we know and love. Well
said, Bill. And as we move to a later work, the one on the right here, which is characterized from his group that is generalized as multiforms. I think you can see the
Bill,
relationship.
Bill, I'm not sure we can see it.
I think
My
Bill,
screen is covered up.
Bill Heidrich, it might be, are you on, can you see the Facebook Live feed as well as the Zoom feed, Bill Heidrich?
I'm not sure, I might. But anyway, if everybody else can see it, fine.
I think we can.
Okay, good.
I think so.
Yeah.
And you know the multiforms, Bill. Certainly, would you? I mean,
Yes.
You mentioned the connection to Avery, and certainly the multiforms, I think, really connect them. And they were very good friends, also, and probably had more in common than he had with some of his abstract expressionist peers. Yet Avery held on to the representational mode of painting for the most part. But the multiforms, which is characterized by this image on the right-hand side, is a move away from the surrealist impulse, which of course is dream-related. It is philosophical surrealism. It's connected to Athenian tragedies, and it's really seen as a way of accessing the subconscious. And from moving visually from this purple painting, this beautiful lavender painting, to these multiforms, it's a radical move that seeks to distill, condense, and kind of minimalize some of the form that's in there. Any thoughts from anyone before I move forward?
I'd like to back up to Milton Avery to give me a 1 or 2 line tutorial on Milton Avery.
I would say, obviously, an American modernist who is distilling down mainly landscape type forms, often and had sometimes with figurative elements as well. But the painting that Avery is famous for looks so similar in spirit to Rothko's multiforms, with one caveat. They move a little closer to recognizability. So you can kind of see that's a shoreline. You see that there are cliffs and maybe a sunset and a horizon, and things that I think Rothko is thinking about to some degree, but they're really visually apparent
and Avery will often include an abrupt compositional element, which in a sense throws you off of trying to understand the image as just a representation of bathers at the beach or someone sunning at the beach.
Yeah.
Instead, you focus on this dramatic compositional color element, which confounds everything else and is very exciting. Bill, I did want to comment on the changes that we see in Rothko now are not unusual amongst artists in America. Hans Hofmann would be a great example, who only got to the biomorphic and he didn't get as far as Rothko did.
Sure.
But he made the transition from the surreal to the biomorphic to the becoming more abstract.
Clifford Still, same story, exactly the same. So that's exactly, I totally agree. Artists of this era, they're all being influenced, they're all looking and kind of absorbing similar impulses. So I think really this move to the multi-form image, this thing on the right, it starts to become Rothko's voice. However, the images I'm going to show you next we're moving fast in time here because we're viewing room live and we have to. But through about an 8 to 10 year period, you're going to see these multiforms dissolve even to a more simplified approach. Arguably, he may have seen the multiforms as too chaotic as he's searching for a meditative, a more contemplative vehicle for his painting. As Sarah and I were speaking earlier, Rothko wrote a lot. He had a lot to say, but he was also very coy in how he was, what he was writing and what he was doing. So oftentimes those things don't jive. But I'm going to show you 7 images, and these are very special to me as an Illinoisan. And the reason is these 7 images comprise Rothko's first museum exhibition, and a museum exhibition in America, and also in Illinois at the Art Institute of Chicago in 1954. Catherine Koo, the famous curator, worked with Rothko for I think over a year, trying to get him to finally commit and settle in on a series of works that were shown, and really in some ways put him on the map internationally. Had you ever seen these works together before, Bill Heidrich?
I don't believe that I have. Where are they dispersed?
They're
now,
all,
or just...
yes, they're all owned by different owners, including Rothko's children. It took me quite a while to track all 7 down. They're kind of hard to find even online.
Bill,
I heard,
as an aside, it would have been nice if the Art Institute had bought the whole group.
Right.
Remember, they bought Nighthawks, the great Hopper, out of a show, and of course the great Grant Wood, American Gothic. Would have been a trifecta if they bought all of these. Wouldn't have cost them much, I'll bet.
Right.
I was listening to an interview with his children, and they talked about, one of them mentioned that he identified very strongly with Turner, which surprised me a lot, and that he must have had an affection for landscapes. But when you mentioned landscape earlier, when we were talking about the transition from surrealism to this multiforms format, right. I was surprised that he was thought of himself as sort of a kindred spirit of Turner.
That's fat. Well, absolutely, and I can definitely see this. I mean, Turner and Rothko are both visionaries in terms of color, obviously, and atmospheric space, which we see is happening in these images. The color tonation and the variety is so elegant and well selected, in my opinion, that I just love seeing them together. I just wish we could go in a time machine and see this exhibition. The advent of this, what we would call his mature style, his signature approach to painting, is very recognizable to the public now. Yet it had a kind of dual end to it, which is he hated the idea of being referred to as a colorist. In Rothko's day, a colorist might imply that there's nothing more to your painting but color. He clearly was a colorist. I don't know that there are many people who
no
would
doubt.
Don't tell him.
But don't tell him.
No one tell him.
He states on many occasions he's really interested in expressing human emotion, things like ecstasy and doom, and these really Herculean kind of concepts that really are beyond just the vernacular of painting at the time. I mean, this is talking about the whole history of art. When you talk about these things, I mean, there's an expansion of content here that one could maybe argue Jackson Pollock is pushing the expansion of his content as well. But these are fascinating images in that they do a couple things. They acknowledge the picture plane. They acknowledge that rectangle that you almost feel like these things are trapped in. But I suspect he had a different idea of what this color was doing. Sarah, you've seen some Rothkos in your travels, I'm sure.
I have. The first time I was exposed to Rothko was when I was I think I must have been in college. It must have been around 1986. And I was in New York. We went to the Guggenheim, and there was an exhibition of Rothko. And the Guggenheim, of course, is a spiral ramp designed building. It's a beautiful place for an exhibition like this, because it chronologically showed his evolution from being a representational painter and all the surreal. And I only knew Rothko as these, color block looking things. And I realized as we started at the bottom of the museum and went up that it was really an evolution. It was really cool. And I still, I'm sure barely understood his progression as an artist. I'm still obviously learning the basics now, but it was a really fun way to look at his evolution as a painter and then kind of come to see what the multiforms concept was. And I still don't, it's hard to understand. It's hard to digest and understand. And when I said earlier that he wrote a lot. I haven't read much of his writing, but I know that he wrote a lot. And apparently he wrote a lot less later on because as he has this less representational work, he said that he wanted to let people interpret it themselves and not suggest what he had been thinking as the painter. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And I think this is probably much more complex work than meets the eye, which is why it's fun to listen to you guys talk about it.
The one aspect about this image, unfortunately, that none of us can experience right now is the scale of
It's
these
huge,
works, which are just really, even in the kind of language of abstract expressionism, so-called action painting, which is a term that was used. I don't believe Rothko was very enamored by that term. But these are not only human scale, they're actually larger than human scale purposely. He understood that these paintings could be seen as egomaniacal to some degree, but he wasn't concerned about that as much as he was providing this experience. And often in these paintings, he would talk about viewing them from a distance of a whopping 8 inches. I
read that, yeah.
So
if you'll indulge me, I'm going to read something that I read relative to the size of this, of this kind of work. It says, for some critics, the large size was an attempt to make up for a lack of substance. In retaliation, Rothko stated, I realized that historically the function of painting large pictures is painting something very grandiose and pompous. The reason I paint them, however, is precisely because I want to be very intimate and human. To paint a small picture is to place yourself outside your experience, to look upon the experience as a stereopticon view or with a reducing glass. However, you paint the larger picture, you are in it. It isn't something you command. So I thought that was interesting perspective about these giant works.
Wow, that's beautiful.
Yeah. But it's also, Sarah, worth recalling. There are periods when he spent time doing very small personal works. I mean, things that you sort of take home and put over your whatever. And I tend to think that it was the confrontation that he sought. I believe it was somewhat theatrical. And yes, you can say, I want to have these things experienced 6 inches away. There's a little bit, and Picasso certainly pioneered the getting your face stuff. And it was not unusual for artists. And if you read a lot of his work, it's not always entirely, in my view, consistent. I think he's trying to be provocative. He's trying to tease. He's trying to push. He's trying to shove. And he had a great delight in working in the small works, and they are fabulous. They are just some of the most spectacular small works of art on paper in the 20th century. And they're just as good as the big ones.
Are the small works also these multiforms, or are the small works all representational?
Yes, it's like some people have thought they were studies for the big ones, but they don't seem to be. But boy, they sure look like it, and they work just as well.
Wow.
So I think he's being provocative. He's provocative.
Absolutely.
He's pushing us.
He had an ear for the theatrical. There's no doubt about it. He understood exactly how people saw him and did enjoy a little bit of confrontation. There's no doubt about that.
I like that.
As we move forward, I want to show you an image, and Bill knows this image very well, I'm sure. I want to preclude speaking. Sorry?
I said it's one of my favorite spaces in the world.
I thought it might be. Before we go into the space, I want to mention that in 1958, Rothko is underway, taken a commission under his wing and moving forward with it. It is commissioned by the Seagram family for the famous Seagram building in New York City, for the Four Seasons restaurant, which we've all heard of. And anybody who knows anything about Mark Rothko knows where we're going with this. We're going to get deeper into the Seagram murals in a minute, but I want to mention that as he's working on these murals, he takes a trip to Italy. It's one of the famously referred to excursions that he traveled extensively in Italy, almost searching for something, it seems. And this is one of the spaces that he saw. And Bill, I'll let you take it over and tell us what we're looking at here.
I was delighted to listen to you. It's the Laurentian Library in Florence, a project of the Medici for the Medici Library. And the space itself, before Michelangelo dealt with it, was a very difficult space to deal with. And Michelangelo resorted to several, frankly, theatrical tricks to come up with this program of representation, articulation of this interior space that is absolutely magical. And after you go through this transformative space, you walk up the stairs and you're literally right there in the library. You know, at that moment, one of the greatest libraries in the world. In fact, we touched on this earlier with Bellini. It was in this library that some of those great manuscripts were now viewed for the first time by authors such as Plato and Aristotle that had come from the East. It was one of the extraordinary spaces. So Bill, back to you.
And he felt the same way, Bill. Mark Rothko was absolutely floored by this space. He had visited already one time 6 or 7 years prior, but came back specifically to it. Made mention that one of the things that he connected with in this room was this trapped quality that you get in this room. And I remember feeling the same kind of, as you get into the library, it opens up into this wonderfully expansive and long hall. But in this particular entrance to the library, as Rothko himself mentioned, he felt he was looking for that this was a kind of reveal to him that he could apply to his paintings and make the viewer feel as if they were trapped in a room where all they can do is forever butt their heads against the wall. And again, that confrontation and that tension and that a little bit of an aggressive disposition in Rothko is coming out here. He's really trying to jar. He's looking for something to help him jar his work into a more meaningful place. And how inspiring this room is.
It's actually, Bill, it's actually amazing because I think there's still that train of thought of people who look at a Rothko painting and think, gee, I could do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
But when you dive into some of these things like his responses to this architectural space, you begin to see the substance, the true substance, the depth of Rothko's imagination, his thinking, who he is, and what he's reacting to, and where it takes him forward in his work.
Well said. It's exactly right. And when he gets back, and I'm going to bounce back and forth a little from his trip to Italy, so bear with me, but as we digress a little on his trip, I'm going to show you a little bit of, maybe some of you have seen these before. These are early paintings that are going to manifest themselves into these famous, which I think ended up becoming about 30 paintings that encompass the murals for the Seagram building. And what we see here is fascinating, an incredible move from those signature style works at the Art Institute of Chicago we just saw. So clearly that trip to Italy jarred him, and you can see that we have it's almost as if we have an opening within a hole, within another opening, within a hole. Like there seems to be this argument in the picture plane as to what we are doing. Are we coming? Or are we going? Are we entering? Are we? Is this a doorway? Is this a figure? Is it the size of a figure? Kind of this portal type of illustrative effect. But this is the style that begins to emanate. It was percolating before his trip when he went to, see these masters again. He starts to have a little bit of a break, and I mean a break a little bit in the negative and in the positive sense. His work, he is getting a lot of criticism from his peers that he's just doing knockoffs and paintings that can hang over, a couch and go with the drapes and that kind of thing. And nothing would make him more mad than that. So he's really pushing hard to find deeper content, or at least the content that he can deliver in a deeper way. And as we move forward into the Seagram murals, here is what he ends up with, which, these are on view at the Tate. Sarah, I don't know if you've ever seen these in London. They're magnificently displayed there.
I don't know that I've seen them. I haven't been to the Tate in a long time, and I can't tell you whether I've seen them or not.
Sure. The image in the lower left is the restaurant. So now we're at this interesting place in Rothko's career, where now he's making, and I think he realizes it, right? I'm making paintings for restaurants. And that realization, I think, moves him to do something that is quite unprecedented in art history. When undertaking a major commission, he turns it down. He turns all the painting. He calls Philip Johnson, who's part of the architectural brainchild of this, and says, you know what, you can't have the paintings. Sorry, it's not the right place. The story goes he's in a restaurant. He's in the restaurant eating, and it's a great story. He so-called says, I accepted this challenge to make sure that every son of a bitch eating in this restaurant loses their appetite. So there's another bit of anger and animosity and forgive the vulgar, renunciation there, but that's the way he felt about this commission at this point, signaling there's something bigger going on in his work than paintings in a restaurant. But
Bill, I would comment though at this point, as crazy as we might find that, his rigid adherence to this standard, his own standard of what it was he was trying to accomplish, is what ultimately allowed him to do the things that he did. I find it curious as an aside, and you think about the two paintings we've already discussed by Leonardo and Giovanni Bellini, works of art that Rothko would no doubt have really connected with and understood the roles of art played by those people in their time, and that there is a function for public art. But he was so determined he would not allow, these incidental things.
Right.
Fra Angelico didn't worry about what the monks were doing in their little rooms where he did all the frescoes. Or did Leonardo worry about the monks in the refectory when he did the Last Supper? Oh, good, you happen to have those.
Quelle surprise.
So it's interesting to me that Rothko's really pushing further. He's taken so much from Michelangelo and the Laurentian library, all these experiences, yet I think he's set himself an even higher standard. He's not going to lower his standards.
Absolutely.
And that's remarkable. And that's, I think, why he did so well.
I read somewhere that when he took the Seagram's commission, I'm not sure that he understood that it was going to be in the Four Seasons restaurant, that it might have been in a more important place or something, and then was disappointed to find that it was going to be in the restaurant where there were diners. And I also read that he was disgusted because he grew up, with humble means. He was disgusted at the idea that people would pay so much for food, and when he ate in the restaurant, he was really appalled by the idea that would be the atmosphere in which his paintings would be viewed.
So let me clarify that a little bit, Sarah. Everything you
Okay.
said is exactly right. He did write those things, but I don't believe them. He absolutely knew these were going in a restaurant. He knew for a very long time. And he also knew that it was going to be the restaurant in one of the biggest and best restaurants in the world. However, what I think he did not count on was this moment where, he's eating with these people, and I think he just figured it out. This is not what I'm supposed to be doing. However, he did know one thing. He was moving toward this idea that his paintings really need to be in a space, in a specific space, in a cultivated space, and in a curated space that exists beyond and above museums, that the space that he can own. And I think that's where he was hoping to take this project. And when he saw that there was no way these paintings were going to transform the Four Seasons, like this image that you're looking at here, which Bill alluded to, the San Marco frescoes by Fra Angelico, which are just, Rothko saw these. He was absolutely in love with these. There are about 39 of these in the monastery, and every one is a little different. If you note here, every fresco is kind of jarred into place. They surprise. And as you see them through doorways and windows, you can't quite get the whole thing. There's this invitation of a passage through the door to envision how each of these cells looks. And he knew there was no way he was going to get this out of a restaurant.
As you're talking about his confidence in his work and the importance of it, and that it needed a place to be appreciated, it brings to mind that he, might have been an obsessive sort of all-night painter kind of guy who was really focused on his work. And when I listened to the interview with his now older adult children, they said that he was very much a very present father who worked kind of a day job in his studio and would make it home for dinner most nights, and played with them on Sundays, and did very parental things, and had a very nice balance of home life and work. So he might have been very convicted and very confident in the value of his art, but it was kind of refreshing to hear that it didn't consume him.
Right.
Or maybe it did. I mean, I gather he ended his own life in 1970, but there's much more complexity to the story.
There are also stories that he would live in his studio for quite a long time, and there were times where he would just not be home. His marriage was a little bit shaky as well. His children remember him fondly, there's no doubt, but he always had a bed in his studio, and he lived a little bit of a monastic life. I think he was communing with these spaces, because I think he saw himself a little bit as a monk, a kind of philosopher monk, as it were.
Bill, are we near the more explicitly or with intended to be spiritual works?
Yes, we are. We're closing in. I'm just going to show you real briefly. We have the first iteration of a room that was instigated by Duncan Phillips. If you've ever been to the Phillips Collection, Washington, D.C., the famous Rothko Room, you can see in the lower left here is an early shot of the room with a chair and a rug, and famously Rothko would walk in there and rearrange things, and Phillips would come back and rearrange them again until he finally convinced him to include this bench, which has been there ever since, as a way to view the works instead of these kind of guard-like chairs. So this being one of the first iterations of a space that Mark could own, that his work actually was made for and was never to be, these are children that are never to be dispersed from each other.
Wish that the Art Institute had done that with that first exhibition. But
I think they bought one. I think they only bought one. And it's an absolute crime, I agree. Back to Italy, I'm going to show you a couple more things here. This is the Santa Maria Assunta Cathedral in Torcello, which is the island a little farther out there by Venice. And he was in this chapel and was very moved by the oppositional forces that you can see here. This is early, I think it's an 11th century. I think the apse is from the 11th century. It's gold leaf, beautiful. I took these shots actually this summer. Very moving. And adding to this, we're kind of adding things up, layering these influences one on top of each other to get to this, which is the chapel next to the Santa Maria Santa is the Santa Fosca, which is, we know he went through there as well. This is an image of that on the upper right over here. And in the lower right and left are images of the culmination, and some fans believe the culmination of Rothko's work. Some maybe have different opinions. The Rothko Chapel, which exists in Houston, commissioned by the de Menils. If you have not been to the Rothko Chapel, you cannot go right now, not just because of COVID, but it's undergoing a $30 million reconstruction that is set to open this fall. So I highly encourage you to visit the renovated, brand new chapel in the fall. And it's important because the paintings in the chapel will be seen in the way they were intended to be seen for the first time. But this incredible kind of commonality with a Christian church, which Rothko did not consider himself particularly religious, Christian or otherwise. You've been to the Rothko Chapel, I'm sure, Bill, right?
I saw the paintings when they were at the National Gallery in Washington.
Okay.
When they were being conserved yet again. And it's interesting you mentioned the $30 million project, and I don't wish to demean the qualities of the work,
yeah,
but the materials that were employed were not stable. Correct. And it has been a nightmare, conservation nightmare, to keep these paintings in a presentable, viewable way. And here, the chapel is being redone again. But it's a worthy cause to try to preserve. They're great paintings. They're staggeringly important.
Bill, you are exactly right. In fact, he is notoriously referred to as not a great technician as a painter, and it's probably not that he didn't have the training. I just don't believe he was that concerned with it. I think he had so much to do that I think he saw himself as a philosopher, not really a painter. He was painting, but he didn't like calling his paintings paintings. They were pictures. They were not fetishizing the paint in any way. He really could care less if they were made out of sticks or rocks or paint or whatever, but paint was the medium that made sense. And I could be wrong on that, but I've heard many times, Bill, that his technical perspective.
He was a little uneven with the attention to the craft, shall we say.
Yeah.
He would often, some of his canvases were carefully prepared, but he would all but go to the local hardware store and buy a can of paint. And people tried to get him to use better materials. Again, there are conundrums in this artist's work, and I think some of it's intentionally fostered. But nonetheless, there have been some serious problems with preserving these works and keeping them stable so that they can be viewed. But again,
Conger,
it's a good call.
Bill Conger, you said that he didn't even refer to them as paintings, he referred to them as pictures. And I gather he quit naming his paintings after a while and just started referring to them as numbers.
Very early on, they became numbers. And then later, Sarah, he started kind of just referring to the coloration. So you might have maroon on red, or is just kind of a simple way to remember what we're talking about. I don't think he had a particular emotional connection to the titles.
Bill, let's open up something here.
Yeah.
We have a thread here with the other two works we've looked at, the spiritual, the sublime, whatever you want to, however you wish to connect them. And it's an important connection. And I think it's a wonderful way for us to consider art and what it can accomplish, what it can bring out in all of us, especially in these strange times that we have. Yet with a Leonardo or Bellini, we always have the narrative content to give us a hook and a handle to get into the picture. And for a lot of people, we have the representational aspects of what the artist is trying to do. That's very comforting, it's very easy. But for people who aren't familiar with art, experiencing these works of art for the first time, it can be off-putting. And I'd like to hear your thoughts, and you too, Sarah, on the spiritual dimension. We are all responding to it, or have responded to these things, but no one's quite articulated what it is. What is it that feels spiritual? What is it that you see? What is it that you experience with these works of art, absent narrative content, absent narrative cues?
Beautiful question, Sarah.
Wait. Oh, I see how this works, you guys. No, I can tell you, for me, I don't see spirituality, but it's very much, I mean, it's you know, like so many people, he leaves it to the interpretation of the viewer. It's not spiritual to me, but it's a very open experience. Looking at these, my first impression as a young adult was to look at these and think, blocks of color. And even as I had walked through the Guggenheim and watched the evolution of his work, I didn't understand it. I still don't understand it. I can't say that I understand, but it becomes more and more interesting and more nuanced and more openly meaningful, not spiritual, but I think that it has a lot more potential meaning the more I learn about it. But spirituality isn't where I go with this. So Bill Conger, I'd be curious to hear how you feel about that.
Absolutely. Both of your comments, very well stated. The question is a very poignant one. You know, I think my connection to these works are really about the journey that Rothko spends an entire lifetime taking, which is this journey toward what? And that I think is why we are so, if we are enamored at all, that's why we're enamored, is that we are trying to take this journey with him. We see 40 plus years of a walk towards something. And my experience in the chapel, I'll bring it back to the chapel. These are very colorful works, actually. And Bill, you saw these outside of the chapel. You probably saw more of the color than I have in my 4 visits to the chapel. But this baffle that exists up here, I'm circling my mouse here, is one of the things that's getting removed. It was never supposed to be in the iteration of the building, but the Houston light was so terribly destructive. They had to put this baffle, which darkened the entire room, and turned it into a mausoleum, which he never intended for this to be. These are very colorful works that really require a meditative experience with them. They require time. They're really time-based paintings, which sounds like an anathema in some ways, but they really require a visitation and a relationship with them to access whatever it is you access. It's very much like transcendental meditation, in that
Bill?
you will find what you are meant to find if you're ready to find it, but you can't access it without the acceptance that there is something to accept or something to find. It's blind faith. It's total, absolute. It's a walk of faith with these paintings, that you aren't just relying on the visual quality of paint and canvas and the way you're looking into something, much like we would stare at clouds or it's why we have favorite colors, for example, I think. But it is a mystery. I think it is absolutely a mystery as to what about these communicate on such a large scale. I think there are many of Rothko's work that I find just terrible failures, as all great painters have. But for me, the travel, this instinct, this kind of impulse, almost an animal impulse toward faith of some kind, is just what I find is terribly lifting and moving about Mark Rothko's work.
Bill, I would expand a little bit on one of the words you used, which I think is so important about Rothko's work, and it's where I find that spiritual dimension, and that is that they are meditations. I find them to be visual expressions of meditation, which in turn causes in the viewer a sense of meditation and spiritual awareness.
Yeah.
And what is particularly interesting to me, always has been, is having seen the Fra Angelicos at San Marco, which is incredible. The small rooms and those wonderful paintings, they are meditations. It's right. The same thing.
Right.
And that connection, absent, I mean, there's so many hundreds of years in between. There's so many formal elements which are so distinctly different, yet they end up in the same place, I feel.
Wonderful.
And I'm gonna work hard not to overstep here, because I'm learning as we go. But I read something that he wrote something about when painters in prior ages painted demons and gods and fearsome things. Those were the things to fear. And as he developed his style, that there were other social evils. Once we understood that dragons and demons probably weren't what we were to worry about, that there were other things like fascism and social evils that were worrisome as well and created conflict. And so rather than the spiritual, I think you can kind of interpret this as a social commentary. Bill Heidrich, you talked about social struggles generations ago, and now we're having similar struggles now culturally. And this work may reflect more social sort of introspection than spiritualism to some people.
Sure, it's timeless, and
yeah.
Well, unfortunately, we keep repeating some of the same mistakes. So,
do you think we'll get it? Do you think we're going to learn?
Well, we've at least got great art to reflect on and find sources of inspiration and perspective and centering ourselves to focus on what's important.
I think it's that brings to the point to me that you guys are experts, I'm not, but it's fun to have a conversation around something that allows us to talk about things that relate to this, things that we fear, things that inspire us, things that we find beauty in, things that make us stop and think. And we can all look at these colorful but fairly monochromatic paintings in this space and get something different from it. And if art is the center of that place where we have the conversation, I think that's pretty wonderful.
I agree, and hopefully we kind of can reflect on this amazing part of American art history, because I feel it's one of the most important parts of the 20th century that America has been able to contribute to the breadth of art, into culture in general. And we have a real treasure in both the works of Rothko, which exist all over the world, and this amazing chapel, a non-denominational chapel. It was intended to receive those of any faith and no faith whatsoever. So a completely humanized approach to the sacred and the sublime. So with that being said, you guys are amazing as always. Are there any other thoughts, or are we kind of there?
I think we've arrived. I think it's well said. I think there we are, and how wonderful to talk about this chapel as a place where anybody can come and find solace, meditation, spiritual nourishment, which we need now. We need it.
Oh, we so need that. And I think of 2020 as the year in which we learned to wash our hands, make a meal for ourselves now and then, be kinder to each other. And if we can use this platform of our viewing room live experiences to maybe use art as a central focus of a conversation that makes us all better. So thanks for including me.
Terrific.
Most excellent. Dr. Sarah Zallek and Bill Heidrich, thank you again. You are absolutely phenomenal, and hopefully I haven't worn you down. We can do another one in the near future. This has been a wonderful experience for me, and thank you for bringing this up, Sarah, and inviting me into your idea to do this. It was a lot of fun.
Thanks for teaching me and everybody else more.
All right, and thank you to all our viewers.
Thank you all.
And our Visionary Society members of the museum. Catch us soon on another Viewing Room Live. Have a great evening.